24 hours inside Leavenworth, America's deadliest prison. The inmates' arrival. They say the first 24 hours inside Leavenworth can break any man alive. The air feels heavier. The eyes that watch you never blink. And the sound, it's not silence, it's a warning. The bus pulled through the iron gates of Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary at exactly 7:46 a.m. From the moment the steel doors clanged behind him, Marcus Reed Johnson knew this was no ordinary prison. He'd served time before, county jails, even a state facility, but Leavenworth felt different. Older. Smarter. Meaner. It wasn't just the razor wire or the stone walls that stretched high into the gray Kansas sky. It was the silence of the men inside. A silence that carried history, over a century of it. Reed had read about this place. Everyone in the system had. Built in 1903, Leavenworth was once the most feared federal prison in America, long before the days of ADX Florence. It was where they sent the untamable. Gang leaders, organized crime figures, spies, and soldiers turned killers, all locked under one roof. As he stepped off the bus in shackles, Reed saw what the newspapers never showed. Rows of inmates standing in the yard, their faces unreadable. Tattoos that told stories more brutal than any police report. Some men had been there decades, others, like him, were just arriving to learn the rules the hard way. The guard's voice cracked through the cold morning. Keep your eyes forward. No talking. You're in Leavenworth now. Inside the receiving and discharge unit, the smell of bleach and sweat hung thick. Every move was mechanical: strip search, fingerprints, medical check, orientation speech. Reed signed his papers with hands still trembling from the cuffs. A veteran guard leaned against the counter, scanning his file. Drug trafficking, assault with intent, HM, he muttered. You might fit in just fine here. According to federal court filings from the mid-2010s, Leavenworth was still housing a mix of medium and high-security inmates despite its official classification. It had seen riots, smuggling rings, and corruption scandals stretching back decades, including one that exposed illegal recordings of attorney-client meetings in 2016. Reed didn't know that history yet. But he would learn. Fast. When they handed him his brown uniform, Reed noticed how faded it was, how many other men had worn it before him. The tag inside read simply, "Property of U.S. Penitentiary Leavenworth." The letters felt heavy, like a sentence carved into skin. A correctional officer led him down a narrow corridor lined with cell doors painted the color of old rust. Each one had a small window, just large enough for an eye to stare through. He could feel them watching him, the veterans of Leavenworth sizing up the new blood. He passed one cell where a tattooed man whispered through the bars. "Don't look scared, rookie. They smell fear in here." Another voice, lower, grittier, followed. "Welcome to the kingdom." That's what some inmates called it, the kingdom. A world ruled by codes, alliances, and debts that never vanished. Reed's assigned cell was on Range D2, one of the oldest tiers in the main cell block, the same block that had once housed notorious inmates like Machine Gun Kelly and Robert Stroud, the Birdman of Alcatraz, before his transfer. The walls were thick limestone, cold even in summer, built back when prisons were designed to crush a man's spirit before his body. When the door slammed shut behind him, it felt final. The sound wasn't just metal on metal, it was history repeating itself. That first hour stretched like a lifetime. Every sound was amplified: footsteps on the catwalk, the distant buzz of fluorescent lights, the hum of a world that had learned to move without sunlight. He unpacked the basics: a Bible, a toothbrush, a thin blanket. The guard had told him, "Keep your head down, and you'll do fine." But Reed already knew that in Leavenworth, fine was a fantasy. At 10 a.m., the unit doors opened for yard time. It was his first look at the real Leavenworth, the one no camera crew ever captured. According to Department of Justice reports, the yard was once a place of frequent clashes, race-based alliances, contraband deals, and silent power shifts controlled by prison gangs. The Aryan Brotherhood, the Mexican Mafia, the Gangster Disciples, and the DC Blacks, all had roots that ran deep here, long before the federal system spread them across the country. Reed walked out cautiously, eyes darting. The yard was split in invisible lines, every race and faction claiming their ground. A simple mistake, like sitting at the wrong table, could start a war. A tall inmate approached him, tattoos crawling up his neck. "You knew?" "Yeah," Reed said. "Then listen up," the men replied. "This ain't no rehab center. You pick a side, or you stay alone. And alone don't last long." Reed nodded but said nothing. He'd been warned about this moment, the silent initiation. In Leavenworth, neutrality was a death wish. He looked around the yard, weights clanging, guards pacing the towers, and groups murmuring in low tones that carried more threat than noise. Somewhere near the fence, a fight broke out, quick, surgical, and over in seconds. The guards didn't even sound the alarm. Just another Tuesday at Leavenworth. By lunchtime, Reed had seen enough to understand one thing: violence here wasn't random. It was currency. According to news investigations, Leavenworth had a long record of inmate-on-inmate assaults, often linked to gang hierarchies or contraband operations. Everything had a price: protection, silence, food, even a phone call. In the chow hall, Reed picked up a tray and found a seat at the edge. The food was gray, flavorless, like everything else in the building. Across the room, two inmates argued quietly. Within minutes, one was dragged out by guards, his shirt soaked red. No one looked up. Not even the staff. It was the unspoken law: don't see, don't speak, don't die. That night, the cell block lights dimmed at 9 p.m. From somewhere deep within the prison, Reed could hear faint tapping, coded messages passed through pipes. Old-school communication that predated smartphones, maintained through rhythm and patience. He lay on his bunk staring at the ceiling, the concrete glowing faintly under the flicker of the hallway light. His cellmate, a quiet man named Torres, spoke without looking at him. "First night's the hardest. You'll learn who runs what soon." "Who runs this place?" Reed asked. Torres smiled. "Eyes still closed. Not the guards. Not the warden. The men who've been here long enough to forget what sunlight feels like." As midnight crawled by, Reed realized this wasn't just prison, it was an ecosystem, built on control, fear, and unbreakable hierarchy. Every inmate was a piece of a larger puzzle, a living, breathing machine that had run for over a century. According to historical records, Leavenworth once held over 2,400 inmates at its peak, including soldiers, mobsters, and war criminals. Some never made it out alive. Reed closed his eyes, trying to ignore the distant scream echoing from another tier. Somewhere out there, a fight had ended badly. The guards would find out in the morning, maybe. Inside Leavenworth, time didn't move forward. It just looped, replaying the same chaos day after day, decade after decade. By dawn, Reed was no longer the same man who had stepped off that bus. He hadn't spoken to more than a few people, yet he'd seen enough to understand what survivors meant when they said, "Leavenworth changes you, even if you make it out." The light that crept through the bars didn't feel like hope. It felt like a reminder: he had 23 more hours to go, and this was only the beginning. The politics of survival. When morning came, the air inside Leavenworth was already heavy. The fluorescent lights buzzed awake before the men did, bathing the cell block in a harsh, sterile glow. Reed hadn't slept much. Every sound from the night, the scraping of boots, the metallic clangs, the whispers through the vents, played like an endless loop in his mind. He had survived his first night, but in Leavenworth, survival was never just about staying alive. It was about learning the code before it learned you. The cell doors clanked open at 6 a.m. sharp. "Count time," a guard barked from the tier. Each inmate stood silently at attention, faces blank, eyes forward. The ritual felt almost military, precise, cold, unforgiving. According to Bureau of Prisons records, Leavenworth had long maintained strict count procedures, 5 times a day, no exceptions. One mistake could lock down the entire compound for hours. After count, breakfast followed. Reed shuffled into the chow hall, trying to ignore the stares. By now, word had spread that he was new, and in a place like this, new was another word for target. He sat alone again. Oatmeal. Powdered milk. 2 slices of bread that tasted like cardboard. Across the room, men grouped together in factions that resembled miniature nations. The lines were invisible but unmistakable, drawn along race, geography, and gang affiliation. A voice interrupted his thoughts. "You plan to eat alone forever, rookie?" Reed looked up. It was Torres, his cellmate, carrying his tray like a man who'd done this 1,000 times. Torres was quiet, but his presence carried weight. Tattoos on his forearms marked him as part of the Serenos, one of the most influential Latino groups in the system. "I don't trust easily," Reed said. Torres gave a faint grin. "Good. That's why you're still breathing." He leaned closer. "You want to make it here, you learn how things work. This ain't just about gangs, it's politics. Every corner's owned by somebody, every favor's a contract." Later that morning, in the yard, Torres gave him a guided tour that no guard could ever provide. "That corner," he said, nodding toward a bench near the wall, "belongs to the AB, Aryan Brotherhood. They handle most of the inside protection rackets. Don't look at them twice unless you're invited." Reed turned his head slightly toward a different group, men sitting under the basketball hoop, mostly black inmates with coded tattoos and serious expressions. "Those are DC blacks," Torres continued. "They don't mess around. They're disciplined. You don't cross their lines either." He pointed again. "See those under the bleachers? That's Paisas, Mexicans who ain't in the gangs but stick together. Respect them too." It was an ecosystem of alliances, formed over decades, the kind that federal investigators have documented since the 1980s when Leavenworth was one of the first major prisons to report cross-state gang influence. To outsiders, it looked chaotic. To insiders, it was structured survival. Reed kept listening, memorizing every word. Torres lit a cigarette and continued, "There's only 3 rules you need to remember here. Don't snitch. Don't owe. Don't disrespect. Break one, you're done." Reed nodded slowly. "What about the guards?" Torres chuckled. "They got their own politics. Some help, some hustle, some just watch. But never forget, even the quiet ones got eyes everywhere." At noon, the yard buzzed with tension. A fight had broken out near the laundry unit. 2 men rolled in the dirt, fists flying, until one pulled a shank. The crowd dispersed instantly, silent as smoke. According to incident reports and local news coverage, Leavenworth had averaged dozens of serious assaults per year, most of them classified as gang-related. But what struck Reed wasn't the violence itself. It was how routine it felt. The guards rushed in seconds later, pepper spray, cuffs, the whole drill. But within minutes, the yard was calm again, as if nothing had happened. Torres exhaled. "That's just business. You'll see more." That afternoon, Reed was assigned to kitchen duty, a job that insiders said could make or break an inmate's reputation. The kitchen was the prison's heartbeat, where information, favors, and contraband all flowed under the disguise of routine. As he scrubbed trays beside an older inmate named Big Hank, the men glanced at him and said, "You knew, huh?" "Yeah. Keep your mouth shut, and you'll stay out of the freezer." Reed wasn't sure if that was advice or a warning. Big Hank had been inside since the late 90s. According to whispers, and later confirmed by archived court filings, he'd been part of a smuggling ring that once ran through Leavenworth's commissary and kitchen staff, moving tobacco, drugs, and cell phones through fake cleaning supply deliveries. The operation had been busted years ago, but the memory of it lived on. Reed could feel it, the way every glance and gesture carried hidden meaning. Even stirring soup could be a signal. That evening, during shower time, Reed saw another side of prison life, the unspoken code of vulnerability and control. The showers were communal, open, and silent except for the sound of running water. No one talked. No one made eye contact. Torres had warned him earlier, in here, respect is survival. Don't look, don't stare, don't turn your back too long. Reed followed every word. When they returned to the cell block, a rumor was spreading, someone had been caught with a contraband phone, hidden inside a shoe. The guards tore through cells, flipping mattresses and scattering property across the floor. Reed's cell was searched too. Nothing found. But the way one guard looked at him, like a man sizing up fresh meat, told him what he already suspected. In Leavenworth, guilt wasn't always about what you did. Sometimes it was about who didn't like you. As night fell, Reed sat on the lower bunk, staring at the concrete wall. "Torres," he said softly, "how do you stay sane in here?" Torres smirked. "You don't. You just learn not to lose it in public." He paused, then added, you think this place is about punishment? Nah. It's about control. Everything they do, from the noise to the silence, it's designed to remind you that you don't matter. Reed nodded slowly. He could feel that control seeping in, the way time stopped meaning anything, the way names blurred into numbers. Somewhere beyond the walls, life went on. But inside Leavenworth, the world had its own clock, its own government, its own truth. At lights out, Reed heard faint whispers traveling down the range, the same coded tapping he'd heard the night before. Tap, 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 pause. Then again. He didn't understand it yet, but Torres translated in a low voice. They're passing word about the fight earlier. Retaliation's coming. Reed swallowed hard. Tomorrow. Maybe. Maybe tonight. Don't sleep too deep. According to FBI reports on prison communication, such tap codes had been used for decades to coordinate movement, send warnings, or issue orders even under lockdown. The guards tried to stop it, but it was like plugging a leak in a sinking ship. Hours later, Reed woke to the sound of boots running and radios crackling. Code red. Code red, a guard shouted. Through the bars, he saw flashes of light, the sound of metal striking metal. 2 cells down, a man was being dragged out, blood streaking the floor. Another fight. Maybe revenge. Maybe random. No one ever really knew for sure. Torres whispered, "Told you. Everything here comes back around." As the chaos settled, Reed lay back down, staring at the ceiling, the echo of violence still ringing in his ears. He realized something then: Leavenworth wasn't just a prison. It was a living organism, feeding on fear, loyalty, and silence. And every man inside was part of its bloodstream. Tomorrow, he'd have to choose, remain an outsider or align with the side. Because in Leavenworth, neutrality was extinction. The first test. The morning came with an unnatural stillness. The yard was closed. The corridors were quiet. Even the guards walked differently, slower, alert, anticipating something. Reed could feel it in his bones: the storm was coming. Torres didn't say much at breakfast. He didn't need to. One look told Reed that whatever was about to happen had been in motion long before he arrived. "Keep your mouth shut today," Torres muttered. "You hear nothing, see nothing. That's how you live through it." At 9 a.m., the cell doors opened for work assignments. Reed returned to the kitchen. But the energy there was different too, quieter, tenser. Conversations stopped when he walked in. Big Hank gave him a nod, subtle but meaningful. "You're with me today, rookie," Hank said, sliding him a crate of potatoes. "No questions. Just work." Reed followed. In the far corner, 2 men whispered over the sink, glancing toward the door every few seconds. One of them, a thin man with ice-blue eyes, wore an Aryan Brotherhood lightning bolt on his neck. The other had a spiderweb tattoo creeping up his temple, a silent signal that his loyalty had already been earned in blood. Reed had read about men like them in federal intelligence briefings: enforcers, shot callers, the ones who gave orders no guard could trace. Whatever was coming wasn't random. By lunchtime, rumors had spread like wildfire. Someone from the gangster disciples had been jumped in the laundry the night before. Retaliation was expected, maybe today, maybe tomorrow. Torres's words echoed in Reed's head: retaliation always comes. The Federal Bureau of Prisons' annual reports had long cited Leavenworth as a recurring flashpoint for gang-related violence, often sparked by small triggers: a debt unpaid, a word overheard, a line crossed. Reed didn't know the details. But he could feel the tension tightening around him like barbed wire. At 2:30 p.m., the yard reopened. The Kansas sun was high and sharp, cutting across the limestone walls. Inmates poured out in lines, faces blank, but eyes scanning. The factions took their places. Aryans under the wall. Serenos by the weight pit. DC blacks near the bleachers. Everyone watching everyone. Torres and Reed sat on a bench near the track. Reed could feel his pulse pounding in his throat. "Why are we even out here?" he asked quietly. "Because they want us to be," Torres said. "The warden knows tension keeps order. Fears a better guard than any gun." Suddenly, movement, fast and deliberate. 2 men broke from the crowd, sprinting across the yard. Another followed, clutching something shiny in his hand. Then chaos. Shouts erupted, boots thundered, and the air filled with that unmistakable sound, metal meeting flesh. Reed froze. Guards yelled for everyone to get down. Sirens screamed. Men hit the ground, some too slow. A single shot fired from the tower, warning, not kill. Within seconds, it was over. 2 inmates lay bleeding on the ground. One was from the Aryan Brotherhood, the other from DC Blacks. Both barely breathing. The crowd stayed silent. Everyone knew what this meant, the fragile peace was broken. Back inside, locked down. Sirens blared through the tears. Guards stormed the cells, barking orders. Reed and Torres were pushed inside, door slamming shut behind them. Now it starts, Torres muttered. The investigation, the punishment, and the politics. He explained what Reed would soon learn firsthand. After every violent incident, there were 3 wars, the official one run by the administration, the unofficial one waged between factions, and the silent one fought inside every man's head. Days passed in lockdown. The only sounds were the clank of food trays and the hiss of radios. No yard. No phone calls. Just confinement, 23 hours a day, 1 hour of shower and pacing if you were lucky. According to court filings and human rights reports, prolonged lockdowns at Leavenworth often stretched weeks after major incidents, creating a psychological pressure cooker where paranoia thrived. Reed could feel it, the creeping isolation, the hunger for noise, the way silence turned thoughts into enemies. Torres kept him grounded. You gotta stay busy, he said. Reed. Think. But never let your mind eat you. Reed tried. But it was impossible to ignore the tapping, the coded messages that never stopped. Every night, he heard it, faster now, more urgent. The war outside was still moving. Even locked doors couldn't stop it. A week later, the lockdown ended. The doors opened again. The smell of sweat and tension flooded out like gas. Reed noticed something new immediately, the stares. Everywhere he walked, men were watching him. Some curious. Some hostile. At lunch, Big Hank leaned close. You were in the kitchen that day, right? Yeah, Reed said cautiously. You saw who moved first? Reed hesitated. Didn't see anything. Good answer, Hank said. Keep saying that. He lowered his voice. But there's talk that the Brotherhood thinks you might have known something. They're looking. Reed froze. He'd done nothing, but in Leavenworth, truth was irrelevant. Perception was law. And right now, perception had painted a target on his back. That night, Torres gave him the unvarnished truth. You got 3 options, he said quietly. Join a side. Buy protection. Or pray you get transferred before they find you. Reed stared at the ceiling, trying to process it. What would you do? Torres didn't blink. I'd choose who scares me least. According to Department of Justice investigations, protection networks inside Leavenworth often operated like underground economies, favors traded for safety, information exchanged for silence. Sometimes even guards got caught in the web, knowingly or not. For Reed, the decision was no longer about morality. It was about survival. The next morning, he made his choice. He found Big Hank in the kitchen. I need to talk to Torres's people, he said firmly. Serenos. Hank studied him for a moment, then nodded. Then you better learn fast, rookie. Because once you join a family in here, you don't walk away. Reed didn't argue. He knew. Somewhere deep inside, a part of him was already changing, adapting. The fear that had once paralyzed him was turning into something else. Focus. Leavenworth was teaching him its first lesson: you don't survive by being strong. You survive by being useful. By nightfall, word had spread. Reed was under the Serenos' protection now. It wasn't safety. It was a contract, a deal written in invisible ink and paid for in loyalty. And like every deal in Leavenworth, it came with a cost. Torres said it plainly, they'll want something soon. Maybe a favor. Maybe a debt. Nobody gets a free pass here. Reed didn't reply. He just stared out the narrow window slit, watching the sun die behind the walls that would keep him in for years. In that fading light, he understood what Leavenworth really was. Not a prison. A chessboard. And he'd just made his first move. Disclaimer. This story is a dramatized adaptation inspired by real events. Some names, places, and details have been changed for privacy. Bloodlines and loyalties. The air inside Leavenworth changed once Reed joined the Serenos. The same faces that used to stare through him now gave the short nod that meant acknowledged. It wasn't friendship, it was recognition. And in this place, that was worth more than gold. The tax of protection. With protection came obligation. By the second morning, Torres handed him a folded note no bigger than a matchbox label. Delivery run, Torres said. Kitchen to laundry. You don't open it. You don't ask. Reed hesitated but took it. Inside the laundry, he passed the note to a man pressing uniforms. No words. Just a glance. It was over in 3 seconds. Later that day, Torres said quietly, "Congratulations. You're useful now." That was how the prison economy functioned: favors, debts, exchanges, invisible networks connecting every building. According to a 2018 Justice Department investigation, informal systems of trade in Leavenworth often outlasted warden changes and federal reforms. Cigarettes became cash. Extra food became loyalty. Information was power. The invisible line. At yard time, Reed noticed how small gestures spoke entire languages. A nod between two men by the fence might mean safe passage. A turn back might mean open season. The Aryan Brotherhood watched him more openly now. One man, big, bald, with faded lightning bolts tattooed behind his ears, stared for a long time. Reed pretended not to see. But Torres leaned in and whispered, "That's Dale Red Lawson. Don't stare. He remembers faces." According to federal court transcripts from the 2000s, Lawson had once been named in a prison investigation linking Brotherhood members to coordinated assaults inside multiple facilities. Never convicted, lack of witnesses. In Leavenworth, silence was stronger than law. Whispers of the guards. That evening, Reed heard something new. Two guards talking near the control booth. "Keep your eyes on D-range," one said. "Too quiet lately." The other replied, "As long as they don't cut into my payday, I don't care." Torres met Reed's eyes later. "You hear that? That's the real Leavenworth." There were always rumors, guards trading favors, moving packages, turning blind eyes. According to a 2016 federal lawsuit, some officers were even accused of smuggling contraband and coordinating inmate movements in exchange for cash. The cases rarely led to conviction, but inside these walls, truth didn't need proof. Everyone knew. Debt comes due. By the end of the week, Torres finally said the words Reed had been expecting. "They want a favor." Who? The table. The shot callers. That night, in the shadows of the cell block, Reed met a man named Vega. Short, solid, with eyes that looked straight through you. Vega was the Serenos coordinator for their tier, soft-spoken but absolute. "You earned your seat," Vega said. "Now you'll earn your stay." He explained, the Brotherhood had been moving tobacco through the kitchen line. The Serenos wanted a cut. Reed's job was to find where it was stashed and pass word back, quietly. Reed knew what that meant. If he got caught, it was administrative punishment at best, isolation at worst. If the Brotherhood found out, it was worse than death. Torres clapped him on the shoulder. "You're in the game now, hermano." The search. 2 nights later, during kitchen cleanup, Reed made his move. He waited until the last guard turned his back, then slipped behind the dry storage racks. Under a pile of cracked flour bags, he found a plastic bag taped to the wall, cigarettes, lighters, and small pouches of something darker. He didn't touch it. He didn't have to. When he returned to Torres, he said only, "Flour room. Back wall." The next day, that stash was gone. No confrontation. No alarms. Just vanished. That night, Torres said, "You did good." But Reed could feel the weight of what he'd done pressing down like a second sentence. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was participating. Retaliation in the shadows. The next morning, alarms sounded again. A Brotherhood member was found unconscious near the chapel, ribs broken, jaw wired shut. No witnesses. No suspects. Everyone knew, but no one said it. For the next 48 hours, the prison buzzed like a live wire. Guards doubled patrols. Random searches, shakedowns, tension at every turn. Reed expected a knife under his pillow any moment. According to incident summaries filed in Leavenworth's 2021 security audits, such cycles of retaliation often ran for weeks, self-sustaining, unstoppable until both sides lost enough men to call it even. Torres stayed calm. "Don't look scared," he said. "Fear draws heat. The price of a name." Later that week, Vega approached Reed again. "You did well," Vega said. "Now they know your name." That sentence hit harder than any threat. In Leavenworth, being known was dangerous. Anonymity was armor. Once your name circulated, you became part of stories, and stories in prison had consequences. Reed asked quietly, "What happens now?" Vega smiled faintly. "Now you belong." That's both the blessing and the curse. The breaking point. That night, the tension snapped. While guards conducted a tear search, someone shouted from D Block, a raw, human sound of rage. Within seconds, the entire range erupted, fists slamming doors, voices shouting codes, threats ricocheting down the corridor. Guards flooded the walkway with shields and batons. Reed and Torres pressed against the back wall of their cell as chaos exploded around them. Later, when calm returned, Torres whispered through a cracked lip, "This place, it's not about time served. It's about what it takes from you before you leave." Reflection. When silence finally settled, Reed stared through the tiny window slot at the Kansas night. The stars outside looked cold, almost unreachable. He thought about how easy it had been to cross the line, how survival had quietly turned into loyalty, and loyalty into complicity. Leavenworth didn't break him with violence. It reshaped him with necessity. Every favor owed was another chain. Every alliance another mark he'd never wash off. According to criminology research published in 2020, prolonged incarceration in violent environments often forces moral adaptation. Prisoners learn to conform, not because they want to, but because the alternative is extinction. Reed didn't know how long his sentence was anymore. Time had stopped meaning years, it meant choices. And Leavenworth never let you choose for free. The deal behind bars. Morning crept into Leavenworth through iron and dust. To Reed, it no longer felt like light, just another routine reminder that the world outside was still moving while his own stood still. He'd been inside barely a month, but already the lines between survival and sin had blurred. The air felt charged, as if the walls themselves carried memory. This was the day he'd learned that power inside a prison doesn't come from muscle or rank, it comes from access. And those who control what comes in and out, control everything. Rumors in motion. Breakfast was tense that morning. Men talked in low murmurs over watery eggs. Torres slid into the seat across from Reed, eyes flicking to the guards at the far end of the chow hall. "They're moving product again," Torres said. Reed frowned. "What kind of product?" Torres lowered his voice. "Phones. Maybe pills. Could be weapons. Nobody knows for sure." Reed didn't answer. He already knew that every smuggled object in Leavenworth, from a cigarette to a cell phone, traveled through layers of deals, payoffs, and permissions. According to 2016 court records and FBI surveillance transcripts, multiple Leavenworth employees had been caught helping inmates move contraband in exchange for cash, often under the guise of janitorial deliveries. Those cases made headlines for a few weeks, but inside the walls, the cycle never stopped. The kitchen exchange. By mid-morning, Reed was back in the kitchen, peeling potatoes beside Big Hank. Hank's massive hands worked with surprising precision, each movement slow and deliberate. "You hear the talk?" Hank asked without looking up. "About the phones." Reed replied. "Yeah. You ever wonder how they get in?" Reed shrugged. "Guards. Not always. Sometimes, it's contractors. Food trucks. Even chapel volunteers. Everybody's got a price." He paused. lowering his voice. "There's a shipment today. Big one. You stay clear of it, you hear?" Reed nodded, but he couldn't help asking, "Who's behind it?" Hank gave him a hard look. "The same people who make sure the cameras go fuzzy when things move. Don't ask questions that can get you buried." The Forgotten Wing. That afternoon, Reed's work detail took him past the North Wing, an old section of the prison no longer used for housing, or so they said. The hallway was darker here, lined with peeling paint and rusted doors. One of the guards, a heavy-set man named Carver, walked beside him. Carver had been working Leavenworth for over 15 years. He wasn't friendly, but he wasn't cruel either, just efficient. "Keep moving," Carver said. "You don't want to hang around here." Reed glanced at one of the closed doors and noticed something strange, fresh scuff marks on the floor, like a door that opened often despite being off-limits. Carver caught his look. "Forget it. That's storage. You don't belong here." But Reed couldn't forget. Because in Leavenworth, the places you weren't supposed to see were always the ones that mattered most. The meeting. That night, Torres returned from the yard later than usual. He sat on the bunk and said, "They're calling a sit-down. Midnight. Vega wants you there." Reed's stomach tightened. "Why me?" "Because you kept your mouth shut when it mattered. That counts." At midnight, they met in the laundry, 6 men in total, all Serenos. Vega spoke softly, the hum of the washing machines covering their voices. "The Brotherhood's running shipments through the North Wing. They think nobody knows, but we do. We get 1 crate, they keep the rest. Everybody wins." "Who's delivering?" Reed asked. Vega's eyes flicked up. "A guard named Carver." Reed froze. The same Carver who'd warned him to stay away from that wing. Corruption's veins. According to investigative news reports from the Kansas City Star, Carver's name had appeared years earlier in an internal memo about suspicious inmate interactions, though he was never charged. Inside Leavenworth, never charged meant protected. Reed felt torn. He'd spent weeks trying to stay invisible, but now he was being pulled straight into the bloodstream of corruption that kept this place alive. Torres whispered later, "Don't fight it. If you're in the circle, you eat. If you're out, you starve." The exchange. The deal went down the next night. Reed's job was simple: move a sealed box from the kitchen freezer to the chapel storeroom. No questions, no hesitation. Carver appeared at the back door, flashlight off, uniform crisp. He looked more like a businessman than a prison guard. 2 minutes, he muttered. "Don't make eye contact with anyone." Reed carried the box. It was heavier than he expected. When he set it down behind the chapel podium, Carver took out a phone and typed something quickly. "You didn't see me," he said, and left through the side door. The next day, a rumor spread through the block: phones were back in circulation. Some said drugs. Some said weapons. No one knew for sure. But Vega was smiling, and that was all Reed needed to understand: the deal worked. The cover-up. 3 days later, the administration announced a random inspection. Guards swept the units, dogs sniffed through cells, and supervisors barked orders: theater for the cameras. According to Leavenworth's own audit reports, most searches followed a pattern: advance warning to certain staff, low-risk sweeps, minor contraband confiscated, and a press release about tightened security. Inmates called it the performance. Everyone played their part, and nothing changed. Reed stood in line as officers searched his cell. They turned over his mattress, checked his locker, then moved on. The real contraband. Safely hidden in administrative blind spots. That night, Torres said, "You see how it works now. They control the chaos. Too much peace, they lose funding. Too much violence, they lose jobs. So they balance it. We're just the math. The human cost." Days later, the balance broke again. A young inmate, barely 20, overdosed in his cell. The whispers said the drugs came from the latest shipment. Reed couldn't shake it. He hadn't touched the box's contents, but he'd carried it. He was part of the chain. The news report 2 days later was short: inmate found unresponsive. No foul play suspected. That was all. A human life reduced to 2 sentences. Torres found him staring at the floor. "You can't fix this place," Torres said. "You can only survive it." Reed nodded, but something in him had shifted. He was starting to hate the rules he'd once obeyed. The power equation. Weeks passed. Reed watched how every problem inside Leavenworth was solved with leverage. If you had dirt on a guard, you got favors. If you had loyalty from a crew, you got safety. If you had nothing, you became a pawn. He realized that the gangs weren't the real problem, they were the structure that replaced broken authority. According to a 2022 criminal justice study, prisons like Leavenworth functioned as shadow governments, where order existed not through law but through unspoken codes of survival, enforced by fear, hierarchy, and trade. Reed had entered the system as a convict. Now, he was learning to think like a manager in a kingdom of control. The reflection. One night, Reed sat on his bunk and whispered, "Torres, how does this end?" Torres stared at the ceiling. "It doesn't. You just get transferred, die, or fade into the walls." Reed didn't sleep. He realized that in a place like Leavenworth, every deal had a price, and every man had already started paying, with pieces of himself. The noise of the prison faded as he thought about the outside world, distant, clean, and unreachable. He wondered if the people reading the headlines had any idea what really happened behind those walls. If they did, he thought, they'd understand that Leavenworth wasn't America's deadliest prison because of its violence. It was deadly because it made monsters quietly, out of men who were once just trying to survive. The Warden's game. By the time winter crept over Kansas, Leavenworth felt colder than concrete should ever feel. The chill wasn't just in the air, it lived in the system. Every decision, every silence, every death had purpose. And now, Reed was about to learn what everyone whispered about but few ever proved. Even the warden had a side. The calm before the scheme. It started quietly. Too quietly. The fight stopped. The searches slowed. The chow line even moved faster. After months of chaos, the compound looked almost civilized. Torres noticed it first. "You feel that," he said one morning, darting toward the guard tower. "Yeah," Reed replied. "It's like they flipped a switch." "They did," Torres said. "It's called control through calm." According to Bureau of Prisons oversight memos, wardens often eased restrictions after high-profile violence to restore the illusion of order, not because conditions improved, but because calm reduced outside scrutiny. Inside, the silence meant only one thing: something was being arranged. Rumors of a deal. A week later, Vega called a short meeting after yard time. He spoke low, tone clipped. "There's talk the warden's cutting deals again, trade privileges for peace. Each crew keeps their tier quiet, and the administration looks the other way." Reed frowned. Why would the warden need gangs for peace? Vega looked at him steadily. "Because guards can't reach every cell. We can." It was an old trick, decentralizing control by giving influence to those who could enforce it with fear. According to court filings from the 1980s and 1990s, Leavenworth administrators had long used inmate intermediaries to maintain balance, even rewarding gang leaders with extra privileges for helping reduce violence. Now it was happening again. The warden's game was simple. If the gangs kept order, everyone got fed. If they didn't, punishment fell hard. The hidden directive. The next morning, Reed's kitchen crew received new instructions. Less time in the yard, more time cleaning the administrative wing. At first, it sounded like punishment, until he realized where it led. The admin wing was cleaner, quieter, and heavily monitored. But it also offered something priceless: access. There, Reed saw things most inmates never did: briefcases, sealed envelopes, private security contractors, and officers speaking in coded language. One afternoon, while mopping near the conference room, he overheard two officials talking. "The numbers look good," one said. "Fewer incidents. The press will eat it up." The other chuckled. "Of course they will. We feed them what they want. Order sells better than truth." That sentence burned into Reed's mind: order sells better than truth. The warden's shadow. That evening, Torres pulled him aside. "You know who really runs this place?" "The warden," Reed said. Torres shook his head. No. The warden runs the story. The captains and lieutenants run the business. He explained how supplies were miscounted, food orders inflated, repairs billed twice. Money funneled quietly, justified by violent statistics and inmate numbers. According to a 2021 federal audit, Leavenworth's maintenance and operations budgets often contained unexplained adjustments, some tied to contractual irregularities. Inside, that translated into new uniforms for guards while inmates shared threadbare blankets. The invitation. A few nights later, Vega approached Reed again. The warden's office called a private meet with a few inmate reps, he said. Torres vouched for you. You're coming. Reed's heart sank. Why me? Because you're clean. No record of discipline. You're what they call a bridge. Someone they can use to make peace look real. At dawn, a guard escorted them to a small conference room near the admin wing. There sat Warden Charles Harper, a tall, graying man with a polished smile that didn't reach his eyes. Gentlemen, Harper said. We've had a difficult few months. I believe we can work together to restore balance. Reed watched as Vega nodded politely. The warden's tone was diplomatic, but the message underneath was clear. Keep your men quiet, and you'll get privileges. Fail, and I'll bury you in the hole. Harper ended the meeting with a practiced smile. I don't care how peace happens, he said. Only that it does. The illusion of reform. For the next 2 weeks, things seemed better. Inmates got longer yard times, hot meals, even movie nights. Local media reported Leavenworth achieves record stability. But Reed saw the cracks. He noticed how the peace only benefited certain groups, those who kept the warden's ledger balanced. Men disappeared overnight for breaking invisible rules. And Vega's crew received new supplies that no one questioned. Reed realized the warden's peace wasn't reform. It was management through manipulation. According to an internal DOJ memo, temporary stability in high-security prisons often results from covert arrangements between staff and organized groups. It wasn't corruption in the open, it was cooperation disguised as governance. The trade. A week later, Vega returned from admin with news. The warden's got a new request, he said. A show of cooperation. A donation drive, cleaning supplies for charity. Reed stared at him. Charity. Vega smirked. That's what they're calling it. We load boxes into trucks, the cameras roll, the media smiles. Everyone wins. On the day of the event, cameras lined the yard. The warden gave speeches about rehabilitation and hope. Reed stood in the background, lifting crates he knew weren't full of cleaning supplies. They were filled with contraband confiscated weeks earlier, the warden's own, evidence disposal, repackaged as goodwill. To the world, it was progress. Inside, it was propaganda. The warning. That night, Torres sat on his bunk, face grim. You played the part, he said. Now they think you're one of them. Be careful. One of who? Reed asked. Both sides, Torres said. The warden's men trust you. Vega's crew trusts you. That's good, until one of them decides you're lying to the other. Reed felt a cold sweat creep over him. In Leavenworth, neutrality had already been dangerous. Now, influence was fatal. The silent leak. Days later, word spread that someone inside had leaked information to the press, details about inmate abuse and under-the-table arrangements. The administration blamed inmates. The inmates blamed guards. Reed stayed quiet, but inside he wondered, was this part of Harper's plan too? Sometimes, feeding the press a small scandal kept them from finding the real one. According to a 2019 investigative report, several federal facilities, including Leavenworth, had allegedly used controlled leaks to deflect attention from deeper systemic issues. It was a chessboard. And Harper was the player who always thought 5 moves ahead. The moment of truth. One night, Reed received a message scratched into his food tray. You talk, you disappear. He didn't know who sent it. But he knew what it meant, he'd seen too much, and now both sides were watching him. He told Torres quietly, I want out. Torres laughed bitterly. Out of what? This is Leavenworth. The only exit is transfer or death. Reed stared at the wall, realizing the warden's greatest trick wasn't fear or punishment, it was making men believe they were part of something bigger, while every move only tightened the leash. Reflection. That night, Reed couldn't sleep. He kept hearing Harper's voice, "I don't care how peace happens, only that it does." He realized the warden didn't want justice, he wanted optics. He didn't rule the prison with violence, but with narratives, feeding the public a story of reform while letting corruption thrive behind the curtain. Reed whispered to himself. Leavenworth isn't just a prison. It's a performance. And every man in here is an actor, whether he knows it or not. The fall of control. The illusion cracked on a Tuesday morning. The first sign wasn't violence. It was silence, the kind that feels unnatural inside a place built on noise. Then the guards came, faster than usual, whispering among themselves, radios hissing static. Something big had leaked. By noon, every man in Leavenworth knew the story. A national newspaper had published an explosive exposé. Inside Leavenworth, leaks, lies, and the price of order. It detailed secret gang deals, falsified reports, and internal corruption, everything Harper had worked to hide. According to the article, citing unnamed sources, the warden had deliberately empowered inmate organizations to maintain internal stability, while overlooking the flow of contraband for institutional convenience. The Department of Justice was launching an investigation. Reed read the printed copy that passed through the tiers like contraband gold. His hands shook as he saw the words. According to insiders, peace inside Leavenworth is purchased through fear, not reform. He didn't say a word. But Torres looked at him and knew. You told them, he said softly. Reed didn't deny it. He didn't have to. The reaction. That night, the prison erupted, not in riot, but in chaos of whispers. Some cheered. Others plotted. For the first time in years, the gangs agreed on one thing: someone had betrayed the code of silence. In the yard the next morning, Reed felt eyes on him from every direction. The Brotherhood glared like wolves. The Serenos watched him quietly. Even Vega kept his distance. Torres broke the silence. They think you're the source. Reed's throat tightened. What do you think? I think you were stupid enough to care, Torres said, shaking his head. That's rarer than courage in here. The crackdown. By noon, investigators arrived, suits and briefcases, escorted by federal marshals. They spoke to staff first, then began pulling inmates for questioning. One by one, doors clanged open, men vanished, and rumors multiplied. According to Justice Department field logs later released to the press, agents seized surveillance records, transaction ledgers, and dozens of hours of video evidence, much of it inconsistent with official reports. The warden maintained his calm. Harper held a press conference outside the gates, calling the allegations baseless and a misinterpretation of internal dynamics. But inside, his composure had fractures. Guards whispered that he'd been on the phone all morning, making promises to people higher up the chain. Reed watched from his cell window as federal vehicles rolled through the yard like ghosts. The kingdom was being audited. The warden's retaliation. That evening, Vega appeared at Reed's door. You brought fire into the house, he hissed. Reed stood his ground. It was already burning. Vega leaned close. If I find out you talked, I'll make sure you disappear in a way no warden can stop. Hours later, Reed and Torres were moved, administrative transfer, to segregation. No reason given. Their cell lights stayed on 24 hours a day, meals silent, no yard time. According to federal civil rights filings, such investigative segregation often doubled as retaliation against inmates suspected of cooperating with outside investigators. Torres whispered through the vent, "They're trying to break you before the suits leave. Stay quiet." Inside the hole. Days blurred into weeks. Solitary confinement was its own world, colder, smaller, louder inside the head. The walls seemed to pulse. Every sound magnified, a drip, a shuffle, a distant scream. Reed counted cracks in the concrete until numbers stopped helping. He recited prayers he didn't believe in. He thought of sunlight like a memory he might lose. According to psychological evaluations of former Leavenworth inmates, prolonged isolation produces symptoms similar to trauma, paranoia, memory loss, and time distortion. By day 10, Reed began to hear voices that weren't there. By day 15, he started answering them. Torres tried to anchor him. "They want you to lose it," he said through the vent. "You can't." "Not yet." "Not yet?" Reed asked weakly. "Because when the feds come back, you tell them everything." The collapse. The investigation didn't stay quiet for long. News reports began naming names, officers under suspicion, vendors under audit, one deputy warden reassigned, pending inquiry. Then came the unthinkable: Warden Harper was placed on leave. The official statement cited administrative review. For the first time in decades, the chain of command faltered. Guards argued openly. Schedules broke. Paperwork vanished. With the warden's shield gone, Leavenworth turned inward, a system eating itself alive. Inside segregation, Reed could feel the shift. The guards moved differently. Polite. Careful. Afraid. Torres grinned. "Told you. The higher they stand, the louder they fall." The offer. 2 days later, Reed was pulled from his cell. A federal investigator waited in a small room, dark suit, no expression. "Mr. Johnson," the men said, "we know you have information. You're not under threat, but cooperation helps everyone." Reed looked him dead in the eye. "Everyone? Or just you?" The investigator didn't flinch. "You want out of here alive, son, you talk." Reed thought of Torres, of Vega, of the faces that would vanish if he opened his mouth. He thought of the boy who'd overdosed because of that box he'd carried. And he thought of Harper, smiling for the cameras while men rotted behind his perfect script. He nodded slowly. "I'll talk." The chain reaction. What followed became part of the record, sealed, redacted, but undeniable. Reed's testimony, corroborated by multiple staff confessions, mapped the unseen economy inside Leavenworth, the fake reforms, the smuggled goods, the paper trails buried in audits. According to declassified excerpts years later, his statements contributed to a multi-agency overhaul, dozens of staff transfers, new oversight policies, and a quiet reshuffling of the Bureau's hierarchy. But none of that mattered inside. To the men on the tiers, Reed was finished. A marked man. A rat. Even the guards wouldn't say his name. The transfer. One fog-heavy morning, without warning, they came for him. 2 marshals. Shackles. No explanation. Torres banged on his cell door, shouting, "Where you going?" Reed managed one word: away. According to transfer records filed months later, he was moved under protective status, destination undisclosed. The transport bus rolled out of Leavenworth before dawn. Through the narrow window, Reed watched the towers fade behind him, black silhouettes against a bruised sky. He realized that freedom wasn't the same as escape. He was leaving the walls, but Leavenworth, the noise, the fear, the choices, was coming with him. Reflection. Somewhere in the Midwest, in another nameless facility, Reed sat in a new cell, his world smaller but quieter. He thought of Torres. Of Vega. Of Harper, probably retired, probably fine. He thought about the cost of truth. According to a follow-up report by the Kansas City Star, Leavenworth implemented reforms after the investigation: more cameras, stricter oversight, a new warden with promises of transparency. But old-timers said the same thing. Leavenworth doesn't change. It just learns new tricks. Reed wrote one final line in a notebook the guards never saw. Peace without justice is just another kind of control. And in Leavenworth, control is the only thing that ever survives. He closed the notebook, leaned back, and listened to the hum of the fluorescent lights. It sounded just like home. Ghosts of the past. The first thing Reed noticed about the new facility wasn't the walls, it was the silence. No echo of chaos. No coded taps. No shouts bouncing through steel. It felt wrong, almost staged, like peace had been painted over violence. According to federal transfer logs, Reed's new placement was a medium security transition unit in the Midwest, a holding center for inmates under protective status. To the outside world, it was progress, a man who turned witness now given a chance to rebuild. But to Reed, it felt like exile. A new cage. His cell was smaller than the one in Leavenworth. The paint was fresh, the walls clean, and yet the air still carried that same sterile heaviness, like the ghosts of every cell he'd ever known followed him here. He wasn't supposed to talk about Leavenworth. The federal marshals made that clear. You're under seal now. You don't exist. You say nothing. So Reed said nothing. He watched men pass by his door, new faces, new uniforms, but the same eyes, alert, hungry, suspicious. The system didn't change. It just rotated players. The familiar faces. A week in, Reed spotted someone he never expected to see again. A guard from Leavenworth, Officer Carver. Different uniform, same smirk. Carver caught Reed's stare through the chow line and smiled. Small world, huh? Reed froze. You got transferred too. Carver leaned closer. They call it reassignment. I call it job security. That night, Reed couldn't sleep. If Carver was here, then the system had simply moved the infection, not cured it. According to Internal Bureau of Prisons reports later cited in watchdog audits, staff implicated in misconduct at one facility were often quietly reassigned rather than prosecuted. A bureaucratic sleight of hand that kept scandals contained. Reed realized something chilling. Harper might have fallen, but his network lived on. The quiet trade. Over the next month, Reed watched the same pattern re-emerge. Phones appeared where none should. Extra rations traded for cigarettes. Guards looking the other way when certain men walked down restricted halls. He heard whispers again, not Serenos or Brotherhood now, but a new crew, smaller, quieter, yet unmistakably organized. They called themselves the Line. The Line wasn't a gang in the traditional sense. They were inmates and staff who believed in balance, their own version of Harper's philosophy. If order required corruption, so be it. Torres had once said, Leavenworth doesn't change. It just learns new tricks. Reed was watching the trick evolve. The journalist. 2 months in, Reed received a letter. No name, no return address. Just a single line. They're covering it up. I need your story. He read it 3 times before burning it in the toilet. He knew what it meant, someone out there was still digging. Maybe the same reporter who broke the first story. According to press archives, that journalist, Emily Carson, had gone silent after the investigation. Some said she'd been pressured to drop it, others whispered she'd moved to a safer beat. But now, someone wanted more. And that meant danger followed. The Line's proposal. One evening after lights out, Reed heard a knock on his wall, 3 taps, a pause, 2 taps. The old code. He froze. A voice whispered through the vent, You're the Leavenworth snitch, right? Reed didn't reply. The voice continued, We could use a man like you. You know how the system works. We keep things moving. You get protection. It was the Line, reaching out. They weren't asking. They were offering terms. Reed knew that if he said no, he'd have enemies again. If he said yes, he'd become part of the cycle he'd tried to destroy. He whispered back, I'm done with all that. The voice chuckled. Nobody's done. Not in here. The ghosts follow the living. The flashback. That night, Reed dreamed of Leavenworth. The echo of boots on concrete. The clang of closing doors. The smell of bleach and metal. He saw Harper standing in the yard, smiling as if the cameras were still rolling. Did you think taking me down would end it? Harper said in the dream. This isn't my system. It's yours. You fed it every time you obeyed, every time you kept quiet, every time you made a deal to stay alive. Reed woke up drenched in sweat, heart hammering. He realized Harper was right. The system didn't need wardens to survive. It thrived on the silence of men like him. The secret meeting. Weeks later, during a work detail in the library, Reed met a man who called himself Miller, quiet, middle-aged, eyes too intelligent for a prison yard. I know who you are, Miller said softly. Reed's guard went up. Then you know to stay away. Miller shook his head. You think you exposed corruption. But that story was only half told. He slid a newspaper clipping across the table, an article about private prison contracts, new facilities under federal funding, and familiar names in the fine print. Harper Corrections Consulting, LLC. Reed's stomach dropped. You're telling me? Yes, Miller said. The warden retired, started a firm, and now sells order management systems to prisons across the country. He's turning what he did into policy. According to corporate registration records, Harper's Consulting Group really existed, founded months after his retirement. Its slogan, security through structure. The realization. Reed stared at the paper until his vision blurred. He had thought exposing Harper would end something. But it had only evolved, from secret deals to corporate contracts. Leavenworth wasn't an outlier. It was a template. The ghosts of the past weren't haunting him because they missed him. They were expanding. Every time a new facility opened, every time the Bureau bragged about reduced violence, the same pattern replayed: outsourced control, invisible trades, peace purchased through silence. The decision. That night, Reed wrote again. This time, not to the journalist, to himself. They think control is order. But control without conscience builds monsters. Harper didn't corrupt the system. He refined it. And the rest of us helped by surviving. He folded the note and hid it inside his Bible, the same one from Leavenworth, the same one with his inmate number faded on the inside cover. He wasn't sure what to do next. Speak again, and he'd vanish for good. Stay silent, and the ghosts would win. The visit. A week later, a counselor called his name for a visitor. Reed hadn't had one in months. In the visitation room, behind the plexiglass, sat Emily Carson, the journalist from the first exposé. She smiled faintly. You were right. It's bigger than one prison. You want to tell the rest? Reed hesitated, eyes darting toward the guard behind her. If I talk, he said, they'll bury me. Emily leaned closer. If you don't, they'll bury everyone else. The line went dead silent. He could feel the weight of both worlds pressing against the glass, freedom and fear, truth and silence. After a long pause, Reed nodded once. Let's finish it. Reflection. That night, as lights flickered out across the compound, Reed stared at the ceiling, calm for the first time in years. He wasn't free. But he was no longer running from the ghosts. According to federal oversight updates, more reforms were coming: new transparency acts, whistleblower protections, and independent monitoring teams. Whether they'd change anything was unclear. But Reed understood now that change doesn't start outside the walls, it starts when someone inside stops obeying. He whispered to himself. Leavenworth taught me fear. The system taught me silence. Now it's time to teach them memory. And for the first time, he slept without nightmares. The system exposed. The morning Reed decided to speak, the world outside was already buzzing. Federal reform bills, private prison contracts, rehabilitation initiatives, all polished words that meant the same thing: the system was still running, just under new management. But something had shifted. The story Emily Carson was preparing to publish wasn't about one prison anymore. It was about an entire empire built on silence. The leak. It began with a single file. Emily sent Reed a message through coded mail: confirm contents. Your life depends on accuracy. Inside the envelope were photocopies of contracts, expense ledgers, and emails. They showed how Harper's consulting company, Harper Corrections Consulting, LLC, had quietly secured deals with at least 7 federal facilities. Each contract promised stability solutions, which, according to the fine print, included behavioral partnership programs with inmate leadership structures. Reed's stomach turned. That was the same language Harper had used at Leavenworth, the same system that traded safety for control, peace for submission. According to federal procurement archives and whistleblower testimony, the contracts were genuine. Billions in public funds had been poured into programs that effectively legalized inmate intermediaries, gang hierarchies renamed as peer management models. The ghosts had gone corporate. The plan. Emily met Reed again under federal supervision. The marshals called it interview access for cooperation. She called it truth with handcuffs. She laid out her plan. We drop everything at once: documents, audio, recorded statements. I'll take the heat in the press. You stay quiet until it's safe. Reed shook his head. It's never safe. Emily's eyes hardened. Then it's time to stop surviving and start ending this. He agreed. He gave her his notes, his journals, the small Bible with coded dates hidden inside the margins. Together, they built a timeline of what had really happened, from Leavenworth's old halls to the new facilities now running under Harper's name. The explosion. On March 3, 2027, the Washington Herald dropped the headline that froze the Bureau in its tracks. From Leavenworth to the Nation, how a private network hijacked federal prisons. It was a thunderclap. The article detailed everything: the secret deals, the staged reforms, the manipulation of inmate gangs as instruments of order. The story quoted Reed anonymously as a protected federal witness, describing a culture of control where peace was measured in silence, not justice. Within hours, news networks picked it up. Senators demanded hearings. The Department of Justice issued statements. And Harper's empire began to unravel. According to DOJ press releases, multiple investigations were opened into procurement fraud and ethical misconduct. At least 4 wardens across the country were suspended pending review. Harper himself was subpoenaed to testify before a Senate committee. The consequences. Inside Reed's facility, the fallout came fast. Guards whispered his name again, not as rumor, but as fact. He could feel the shift in the air. Some saw him as a hero. Most saw him as a dead man walking. Torres would have told him to keep his head down. But Torres wasn't here anymore. Transferred after Leavenworth, he disappeared into another prison system, one Reed now knew was probably under Harper's reach. One night, a guard slipped a folded note under Reed's door. No name, just words. You don't expose a machine and expect it not to fix itself. He didn't sleep that night. He just watched the door. The hearing. 2 months later, the Senate hearing aired live. Millions watched as Harper took the stand, gray hair combed, face calm, voice steady. He denied everything. The programs were authorized oversight initiatives, he said. They saved lives, reduced violence, and promoted order. Then Emily spoke. She read from Reed's journal, the words written in the same careful handwriting from his cell. Order built on silence is slavery. Every deal I made to survive became a link in the chain that bound us all. The room fell silent. For the first time, the mask cracked. Harper's lawyer leaned in to whisper something, but the cameras had already caught it, the moment his composure broke. The verdict of public opinion. Weeks passed before official charges stuck, but the public had already decided. Editorials called Harper the architect of America's shadow prisons. Documentaries replayed footage of Leavenworth. Former inmates came forward, their stories aligning with Reed's testimony. According to Senate Judiciary Committee transcripts, internal policy changes were drafted to ban third-party inmate management structures and require independent auditing of private contracts. It was progress, slow, incomplete, but real. Emily won awards for her reporting. Reed watched from his cell on a small TV, the sound low, the image flickering. When she mentioned a source who risked everything to expose the truth, he turned the volume down completely. He didn't need the world to know his name. He just needed to know the ghosts had been seen. The aftermath. Months later, Reed received a transfer notice again, this time to a halfway house. Officially, it was for successful cooperation and model behavior. Unofficially, it was exile disguised as freedom. The facility was quiet, almost normal. He had a small room, a job mopping floors, and a window with real sunlight. But at night, when the wind rattled the blinds, he still heard Leavenworth. The clanging gates. Torres's voice saying, "You don't fix this place. You survive it." He wrote in his new notebook. Maybe survival isn't cowardice. Maybe it's the seed of resistance. Because only those who survive long enough can tell the story. The final revelation. One morning, while reading the paper, Reed saw a small article buried on page 12. It mentioned a new initiative, the Harper Model 2.0, under a different company name, promising data-driven correctional reform. New logo. New executives. Same philosophy. He folded the paper slowly. The machine hadn't stopped. It had evolved again. He looked out the window at the sunlight spilling across the parking lot and whispered. They'll keep building it until someone burns it down. Then he smiled, cold, tired, but sure. Because somewhere out there, Emily was still reporting. And somewhere inside another prison, another man was learning to see the truth. The story would live on. The ghosts would keep whispering until someone else listened. Epilogue: The System Lives. According to a 2028 Congressional Research Service summary, reforms inspired by the Leavenworth exposé were enacted but only partially implemented. Funding for independent oversight waned. Private corrections companies rebranded under new shells. But something fundamental had changed. For the first time, the public looked at prisons not as invisible worlds, but as mirrors of power itself. And every time a journalist asked why, or a guard questioned who benefits, or an inmate whispered this isn't justice, Reed's story echoed quietly beneath it all. Leavenworth didn't die. It multiplied. But so did the truth. Disclaimer: this story is a dramatized adaptation inspired by real events. Some names, places, and details have been changed for privacy.